Annie had always dreamed of escaping her dull routine, but when the chance finally presented itself, she had no idea that beyond that door lay a world where every decision she made could cost her life. And all she could do was play by someone else's rules. Before starting, like and subscribe, it's very important to me. Annie worked as a waitress in a small roadside diner, where the air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and cheap donuts, and the walls had absorbed the conversations of lonely travelers and weary truck drivers. Her life was simple but far from sweet. She woke up in a tiny apartment with peeling walls, hurriedly got ready, pulled on a faded apron, and rushed to her shift, where the same faces, monotonous orders, and endless tips, barely enough to cover rent, awaited her. Day after day, the same routine. Sometimes it felt like time had frozen, trapping her in an endless cycle of gray days. That evening, the diner was nearly empty. At the counter sat old Frank, who came in every day for his usual order, black coffee and apple pie, while staring at a worn-out photograph tucked inside his old wallet. Annie absent-mindedly wiped down a table, lost in thought about how predictable her life had become, when the door swung open. She walked in, tall, elegant, wrapped in a luxurious beige coat, with perfectly styled hair and a leather handbag worth more than Annie's entire monthly earnings. Annie froze, stunned. The woman looked exactly like her. The same face, the same blue eyes with a hint of coldness in their depths, the same cheekbones, the same lips, but her gaze was entirely different. Confident, assessing, piercing straight into the soul. Annie's fingers went weak, and the napkin she was holding slipped from her grasp, drifting slowly to the floor. She stared in disbelief at the woman, who seemed just as shocked but composed herself much faster. For a brief moment her muscles tensed, her brow twitched slightly, and then her lips curled into a mysterious smirk. "Well, well," the woman drawled in a low, slightly amused voice, laced with curiosity as she slid into the nearest seat. "You see what I see, don't you?" Annie struggled to find her voice. Her throat was dry, and her heart pounded heavily in her chest. You look exactly like me," she whispered, feeling her palms grow clammy with nervousness. "And you look like me. What a coincidence." "Though?" The woman leaned forward slightly, tilting her head playfully, her gaze becoming even more scrutinizing. "Do you really think it's just a coincidence?" Annie still couldn't collect her thoughts. She quickly glanced at the mirror behind the counter and saw her own reflection. No, it was her. And yet not her. The stranger looked better, more refined, freer. Like a different version of Annie, the one who had gotten lucky, the one who lived the kind of life Annie could only dream of. "Maybe you should sit down?" the woman suggested, nodding toward the empty chair across from her. Her voice was casual, but there was a glimmer of challenge in her eyes. Annie obeyed instinctively, feeling her heart hammer against her ribs. Her fingers trembled slightly, though she wasn't sure if it was from fear or excitement. "I'm Kate," the woman introduced herself, lazily twirling a perfectly curled lock of hair around her finger. "And you?" "Annie," she answered barely above a whisper, as if afraid to say her own name. "Annie. Interesting." Kate smiled, but her gaze remained sharp and piercing, as if she was analyzing every movement, every emotion. "Tell me, have you ever wanted to run away from here? Leave all of this behind?" Annie froze. The question struck straight into her soul, as if Kate knew all her deepest thoughts, thoughts she was too afraid to even admit to herself. Annie could feel her heart pounding violently in her chest. Kate's question seemed to hang in the air, filling the space between them. Run away. Leave it all behind. It was as if Kate knew exactly what Annie dreamed of during those long sleepless nights, lying in her tiny cramped apartment with its leaky faucet and peeling walls. She swallowed hard, afraid to even nod in response. "You look like someone who's been thinking about it," Kate observed, narrowing her eyes. "Wouldn't you like to know what it feels like to live differently?" Annie nervously traced the edge of the table with her fingers, feeling the rough texture of the cheap plastic beneath her touch. She finally managed to force out some words. What are you even talking about?" Kate smiled, but there was something enigmatic, almost predatory about it. "Just imagine." Her voice was soft, but there was a dangerous undertone lurking beneath it. "You become me, just for a little while. You put on my life like a new outfit. A day, maybe two, maybe a week. You try it on. And I try yours. Annie froze. She wanted to laugh, to say this was a ridiculous joke, but the words stuck in her throat. Kate didn't look like she was joking. Why would you want that? She finally exhaled. Kate leaned her elbows on the table, tilting forward slightly, her eyes flickering with a spark of something alive. Sometimes you just want to disappear, even if it's just for a moment. You know what I mean, don't you? Haven't you ever wanted to escape your life, even for a little while? Annie swallowed hard, her gaze darting over Kate's face, searching for any hint of deception. But there was none. Only certainty. Only the promise of something forbidden and inexplicably enticing. I don't know, she murmured. Kate's smile softened. Think about it, she said. But not for too long. Chances like this don't come twice. Annie watched as Kate reached into her handbag, pulled out a business card, and casually placed it on the table in front of her. Then she stood up, tossed a bill onto the counter, and without a backward glance headed for the door. Annie picked up the card with trembling fingers. Its smooth surface gleamed under the dim diner lights, and one word stood out in bold golden letters. Caitlin Harper. Below it, a phone number. She glanced toward the door again. But Kate had already disappeared into the night. Annie couldn't sleep all night. Kate's business card lay on the nightstand beside her bed, and every time she closed her eyes, the mysterious girl's face appeared before her. What if she actually agreed? What if just this once she allowed herself to take a risk? By morning, her decision was made. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number. The ringing stretched endlessly, and for a moment, she thought about hanging up. But then Kate's voice came through, calm, confident, as if she had known this call was inevitable. I was expecting you, Annie, she said, sending a chill down Annie's spine. They arranged to meet at a hotel on the outskirts of town. When Annie stepped into the room, Kate was already waiting. The space was neat and orderly. A suitcase lay on the bed, and a glass of wine sat on the nearby table. You really decided to go through with it? Kate looked her up and down, as if assessing whether she was truly fit for the role. Annie swallowed but nodded. She could feel her previous hesitation slipping away, replaced by a strange exhilaration. Good, Kate smiled, then opened the suitcase and pulled out several expensive outfits. Then let's begin. First rule, forget your old life. From now on, you are Caitlin Harper. Annie ran her fingers over the smooth fabric of a dress, her breathing quickening. The whole situation felt surreal, but deep inside, something told her there was no turning back. And what happens next? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Kate leaned in closer, her eyes glinting with something unreadable. Now you step into my life, Annie. You'll see what it means to be me. But remember, this game may be more dangerous than it seems. Annie stood in front of the tall mirror in the hotel room, carefully examining her reflection. Her hair, styled exactly like Kate's, cascaded in soft waves, lightly brushing her shoulders. The sharp lines of her makeup accentuated her high cheekbones, giving her gaze a depth and mystery she had never seen before. She wore an expensive dress. The silky fabric was cool against her skin, fitting her figure perfectly. But despite her flawless appearance, her heart was in turmoil. She felt like a fraud, an imposter, as if she had slipped into a skin that didn't belong to her. Well, Kate's voice sounded behind her, calm but tinged with quiet amusement. Now you look like me. The only thing left is to convince everyone else. Annie swallowed hard, feeling her heart hammer against her ribs. This was more than just dressing up. This was transformation. She could feel the world she knew crumbling around her, giving way to something new, unknown, and terrifying. Kate moved silently to the dresser and pulled out a small key, its cold metallic surface glinting under the soft light of the bedside lamp. This is for my apartment, she said, holding the key out on her palm. You need to spend the night there. Memorize every detail, learn the space. No one can suspect a thing. There's a journal in the desk drawer. Read it carefully. It contains things that only I would know. Annie reached out, hesitating before taking the key. Her fingers trembled, and the cool metal burned against her palm, as if warning her of the danger ahead. What if I mess something up? Her voice was quieter than she intended. Kate tilted her head slightly, studying her with sharp eyes before leaning in just enough for Annie to feel her breath. "Then the consequences might be more serious than you think," she said with a slight smile. But there was a cold, almost warning glint in her gaze. Annie looked back at the mirror. The woman staring at her was beautiful, elegant, confident. But inside, she felt completely different. At that moment she realized, her life was no longer her own. She had stepped into someone else's reality, and there was no turning back. Annie stood before the massive oak door of the luxurious apartment in the heart of the city, clutching the cold metal key in her hand. It felt unusually heavy, as if it carried an unknown secret. Her heart pounded wildly, her palms damp with sweat, but it was too late to turn back now. She took a deep breath, trying to suppress the rising anxiety, and slowly inserted the key into the lock. The click was unexpectedly loud, breaking the silence of the hallway. The door swung open smoothly, as if inviting her inside, revealing a world she had never belonged to. High ceilings, intricate molding, expensive paintings on the walls, designer furniture arranged with perfect symmetry. The air carried the faint scent of expensive perfume, soaking everything around her in an air of refined luxury. Yet, despite its beauty, the space felt strangely hollow, a cold emptiness hidden beneath its gleaming perfection. Annie stepped inside cautiously, closing the door behind her. Every step echoed in her mind with doubt. One thought pulsed through her head. "Now I am Caitlin Harper." She slowly moved through the spacious living room, her fingertips gliding over the smooth surfaces of the lacquered furniture, leaving barely visible traces. On the table by the window lay a note, written in neat, precise handwriting. "Do everything as I do. Don't stand out." Beneath it rested a delicate gold bracelet, glimmering in the dim light. Without thinking, Annie slipped it onto her wrist, feeling the icy touch of metal against her skin, as if sealing an invisible contract. She inhaled deeply, recalling Kate's words about the journal, and made her way to the bedroom. Opening the top drawer of the massive wooden desk, she found a leather-bound notebook, its cover embossed with an intricate design. Her fingers trembled as she flipped to the first page, a cold fear creeping up her spine, tightening around her throat. "If you are reading this, it means you've accepted my offer. Remember, you have to become me. Breathe like me, speak like me, see the world through my eyes. Absorb my life until it becomes your own. This is a dangerous game, Annie. The most important rule: never ask too many questions." Swallowing hard, Annie turned the page, feeling her heartbeat slow, like the moment before plunging into icy water. She had no idea how deep this game truly went, or what it would ultimately cost her. Annie was jolted awake by the vibrating phone, shattering the silence of the spacious yet unfamiliar bedroom. Her breathing was unsteady, her heart clenched with sudden anxiety. In the dim light, she fumbled for the device on the nightstand, feeling her fingers tremble slightly. An unknown number. Her hand hesitated over the screen. Declining the call might mean missing an important detail of Caitlin's life. Gathering her thoughts, she took a deep breath and answered as confidently as she could. "Hello, Caitlin." The voice on the other end was male, low, slightly hoarse, as if from a sleepless night or too much whiskey. There was both surprise and mild irritation in his tone. "Where were you last night? I was looking for you. You disappeared." Annie froze for a split second. Fear clenched her chest, but she knew she had to play her role, or her lie would unravel instantly. Adjusting the blanket, she forced herself to relax, layering her voice with lazy exhaustion. "Sorry," she murmured, slipping into Caitlin's manner of speaking. "It was a long day. I just needed some time alone to breathe." Silence stretched across the line, and for a moment, Annie thought her heart would explode. Then came a soft chuckle, short but carrying an unmistakable note of skepticism. "You always say that when you're hiding something," he said quietly. "You think I don't notice? You know you can't keep secrets from me. Or are you actually trying to?" Annie gripped the phone tighter, fighting the urge to take a shaky breath. Whoever this man was, he knew Caitlin well. Too well. She ran through possible responses in her mind, trying to guess what the real Kate would say in this moment. "Of course I know that," she whispered, adding a hint of playful teasing to cover the tension beneath. "But don't you like uncovering my secrets now and then?" He let out a short laugh. There was something both warm and dangerous about the sound. "Sometimes." A brief pause followed, as if he was considering something. "Then I'll see you tonight?" 8 o'clock as usual. Her throat tightened. She had no idea who he was or what as usual meant, but refusing could raise suspicion. Forcing herself to smile, though he couldn't see it, she made her voice sound more confident than she felt. "Of course," she answered. The call ended, but the tension remained. Annie lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling chills crawl over her skin. She had just carried out her first real conversation as Caitlin Harper, and she had pulled it off. But the fear lingered. Her lie was becoming reality, growing roots in this new world. And in this reality where she was Caitlin, there was no easy way out of the game. Annie walked down the street, trying to wrap herself in the confidence she so desperately lacked. Her fingers trembled as she held the phone to her ear, waiting for an answer. Tonight's meeting was inevitable, and she knew she had to play her role flawlessly. Otherwise, everything she had carefully built would collapse in an instant. The speaker crackled, followed by a sharp, irritated voice. "Caitlin, you're late." Annie barely held back a nervous breath. She knew she couldn't let her voice betray her fear. Steadying herself, she replied as evenly as possible. "I'm on my way." Got held up. The air around her felt heavier, thick with the weight of impending tension. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure the passing strangers could hear it. Quickening her pace, she felt the rhythmic click of her heels echo against the pavement. 10 minutes later she arrived at the restaurant, a sleek upscale place with dim lighting and the low murmur of hushed conversations. The air was rich with the scent of expensive wine and exotic spices, making her head swim for a brief moment. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. He was already there, seated by the window, tall, self-assured, with sharp features and an intense gaze. He idly twirled a glass of amber liquid between his fingers, but his eyes never left her. He narrowed them slightly, studying her, and something in that look sent a shiver down her spine. "You look different," he observed, crossing his arms over his chest. A hint of suspicion laced his tone. Annie felt something tighten inside her, but she forced herself to smile. She had to be Caitlin, and Caitlin didn't hesitate. She didn't get nervous. She dismissed suspicions with ease. "Tired," she replied simply, sliding into the seat across from him. "It's been a long day." He kept watching her, and she had the unsettling feeling that he was dissecting every movement, every micro-expression, searching for what was off about her. Her fingers curled into a fist instinctively, and she quickly relaxed them, not allowing her anxiety to give her away. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, raising a brow. His voice carried a new tension, as if he wasn't just asking, he was testing her. Annie met his gaze, forcing herself to stay calm, even as her insides twisted. He wasn't just making conversation. He was studying her, looking for the smallest crack in her story. His eyes seemed to peer straight through her, peeling away the mask she was desperately trying to hold in place. "Of course," she answered smoothly, tilting her head slightly, as if amused by his concern. "You know I always handle things." His lips twitched in the ghost of a smile, but his eyes remained cold. It was as if he was weighing her words, measuring how much truth they held. "That's true," he said slowly, still watching her with quiet intensity. "But lately you've been different." Annie clenched her teeth, her heartbeat a steady drum against her ribs. He suspects something. He knows something is off. She needed to be careful, because if her lie cracked now, the consequences would be far worse than she could imagine. Annie burst out of the restaurant, barely waiting for the moment when the man turned away. His sharp, piercing gaze no longer drilling into her. The cold air hit her face like a slap, making her shudder. She stumbled but quickly straightened up, pressing her hands against her chest as if trying to keep her heart from breaking free. With trembling fingers she pulled out her phone, gripping it so tightly it felt like her life depended on it. She dialed Kate's number and pressed the phone to her ear, feeling her anxiety slowly morph into fear. The dial tone. One ring. Another. A third. "Come on, Kate, pick up," Annie whispered, feeling a lump form in her throat. But on the other end, there was only the monotonous beeping of an unanswered call, a sound that pressed down on her with suffocating emptiness. She tried again and again. Her fingers slid across the screen as she frantically redialed, desperate to hear Kate's voice. But there was no response. Inside her, worry bloomed into full-fledged panic. Kate always answered. Always. Even if she couldn't talk, she would at least send a quick message. But now nothing. Her gaze dropped to the screen as she hastily opened their last messages. The most recent reply from Kate had been sent last night. "Don't worry. Everything is under control." Now those words felt like a cruel joke. "Everything is under control," Annie murmured, feeling an icy fear settle in her stomach. What if everything wasn't under control? What if Kate was in trouble? She looked around, scanning the crowded street in desperation. People moved past her, laughing, talking on their phones, rushing to their own destinations. The world carried on as usual, but Annie felt like she no longer belonged to it. Like she was hovering on the edge of something unreal, something terrifying. Everything around her felt off, unfamiliar. She clenched her teeth, trying to keep her spiraling panic in check. Her breathing was uneven, her thoughts a chaotic blur. What should she do? Where should she go? She couldn't just stand here and wait. Kate could be in danger. Or worse, what if she had been exposed? What if? Annie forced the thought away. No, she couldn't let fear take over. Taking a deep breath, she made her decision. She had to act. If Kate wasn't answering, then she would have to find her herself. With quick, determined steps, Annie headed toward her apartment, silently praying that she would find some kind of answer waiting for her there. Annie reached Kate's apartment, teetering on the edge of panic. Her breathing was unsteady, her chest tight with anxiety, and her heart pounded so violently it felt like its rhythm echoed through the empty streets. She couldn't even recall how she had gotten here. Her legs had moved on their own, as if reality itself had pushed her toward this place. Maybe here, hidden within these walls, lay the answer to the one question that wouldn't leave her mind. Where had Kate disappeared to? Struggling to keep her fingers from trembling, Annie fumbled in her pocket for the key Kate had given her earlier. The cold metal was the only tangible proof that all of this wasn't just a bad dream. She took a deep breath and turned the key in the lock. The sharp click sounded deafening in the thick silence, heavy with foreboding. Inside, the apartment was eerily quiet, but it wasn't the peaceful, cozy kind of silence she remembered. It was something darker, heavier, as if the space itself had been holding its breath, waiting for her to arrive and uncover its secrets. She stepped inside, flicking on the lights, her eyes scanning the room. At first glance, everything looked just as it had before. Meticulously organized, each item perfectly in place, as if Kate had simply stepped out for a moment. But something was off. Subtle but unsettling. Annie blinked, trying to pinpoint what exactly felt wrong. And then her gaze landed on the glass coffee table. A half-empty cup of coffee sat there. Cold. A faint layer of foam still clung to the surface. Annie knew. Kate never left her coffee unfinished. It was a small detail, but it sent an icy chill down her spine. "Oh God," she whispered, swallowing hard. With shaky hands, she pulled out her phone, blindly scrolling through her recent calls until she reached Kate's number. Each ring felt like a hammer striking her nerves. 1, 2, 3. "Come on, pick up," she murmured, her voice unsteady. But the only response was suffocating silence. She tried again, then again. Desperation clawed at her, each unanswered call feeding the growing dread inside her. Kate always answered. Always. Even if she couldn't talk, she'd at least send a message. But now? Nothing. Panic spread through her like poison, twisting her thoughts into chaos. She moved toward the bedroom, searching for any sign that Kate had simply stepped out. But as Annie pulled open the closet doors, an icy terror gripped her. Half the shelves were empty. Kate's clothes, so many of them, were gone. "No!" Annie breathed, her voice barely audible as her body tensed. Her breathing turned shallow, erratic, and her fingers dug into the edge of the door as if trying to steady herself. Then she saw it. Something resting on the nightstand. An envelope. white, neatly sealed, her name written on it in smooth, confident handwriting. Her stomach clenched as she reached out, tearing open the paper, unable to wait any longer. Inside was a short letter, just a few lines, but each word sliced into her like a blade. Annie, if you're reading this, then things didn't go as planned. I had to disappear. Don't look for me. Just trust that I knew what I was doing. If it feels like everything is falling apart, you're right. Most importantly, don't trust anyone, not even yourself. Her lips trembled as she read it again and again, trying to make sense of the words, trying to find something, any clue, any explanation. But the only thought that pounded in her head was a terrifyingly clear one. Who is Kate, really? Annie sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the letter with trembling hands. Her eyes darted over the words again and again, but none of them gave her answers, only more questions. Her heart pounded in her chest, and Kate's voice echoed in her mind. Most importantly, don't trust anyone, not even yourself. The words rang in her head, spreading chaos through her thoughts. What if everything she knew was a lie? What if she had been pulled into a game with no rules? Or worse, what if the rules existed but she had no idea what they were? Suddenly, the distant sound of a car pulling up outside made her freeze. A sharp wave of dread crashed over her, and she jumped to her feet, feeling as though the ground had just vanished beneath her. She rushed to the window, carefully parting the curtains just enough to see. A black sedan had come to a stop outside the building, its sleek surface reflecting the glow of the streetlights, making it look almost menacing. The passenger door swung open, and two men stepped out, both dressed in long dark coats. They moved with a calm, deliberate confidence that sent a chill down her spine. One of them spoke to the other, his lips moving, but Annie couldn't make out the words. The second man nodded once and pulled out a phone. The anxiety in her chest erupted into full-fledged panic. Who were they? Why were they here? Had they come for her? Coincidence was no longer something she believed in. Her frantic gaze swept across the room as fear clawed at her throat. She had to move now. If these men knew she was here, she only had minutes, maybe seconds. Her fingers fumbled as she grabbed her jacket, her hands barely obeying her. The letter trembled between her fingers before she shoved it into her pocket. The front door was out of the question. They could be right outside at any moment. She spun toward the back exit, her pulse hammering in her ears. The stairs creaked beneath her steps, each sound magnified in the oppressive silence of the building. Her breath came in sharp bursts as she forced herself to move faster. Voices, muffled but getting closer. And then, the distinct sound of a door opening. They were inside. Her body screamed at her to run. There was no more time to think, no time to hesitate. The only way out was forward, into the dark, into the unknown, into a game she didn't understand, but had already become a pawn in. Her muscles tensed as she fought against the crushing fear, forcing her legs to keep moving. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm wailed, merging with the pounding of her pulse. Annie took one final step over the threshold, realizing in that moment, there was no turning back. Annie sprinted down the dark alley, her feet barely touching the slick pavement, still wet from the recent rain. Blood pounded in her temples, her breath tore from her chest in ragged gasps, and her lungs burned from the cold night air. Behind her, heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed, at least two people. They weren't running, but they were closing in, moving with a terrifying certainty, as if they knew she had nowhere left to go. Their calmness only amplified her fear. She didn't dare look back. A thought struck her like lightning. What if they were just toying with her, giving her the illusion of a chance, only to shut the trap at the last moment? The idea nearly froze her in place, but terror was stronger than hesitation. Headlights flickered ahead, and Annie veered sharply around the corner, pressing her back against the cold, damp brick wall. Her chest heaved, her hands trembled, and her knees threatened to buckle from exhaustion. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself to think. Come on, Annie, think. But the streets were empty. No pedestrians, no voices, no signs of life. Only darkness, punctuated by the occasional glow of streetlights, and the sound of her own ragged breathing. The voices behind her grew closer. She turned here, one of them said, his voice low, controlled, filled with certainty. Annie's stomach twisted at the tone. There was no anger in it. No urgency. Just that same quiet, unwavering resolve. They weren't searching for her. They knew they would find her. Her eyes flew open as she scanned the alley, desperate for anything that could save her. And then she saw it. A rusted metal pipe, lying abandoned near a dumpster. There was no time to think. She lunged for it, fingers curling around the cold steel, her knuckles turning white. A surge of adrenaline flooded her system, momentarily drowning out the fear. If there was no way out, if she was trapped, then she had only one option. The footsteps drew closer. Their shadows stretched along the walls, long and menacing. Annie held her breath. Every muscle in her body coiled like a spring. The world around her seemed to slow, freezing in a moment of breathless anticipation. Run or fight. She gripped the pipe tighter. In the distance, a siren wailed. The footsteps halted, and for one suspended second, everything hung in a fragile, deafening silence, balanced on the edge of the inevitable. Annie gripped the pipe so tightly that her nails dug into her palm, leaving painful indentations. Adrenaline surged through her veins, drowning out any rational thought. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs, as if sensing the inevitable collision ahead. Time seemed to freeze, trapping her in this narrow, grim alley where the only way out was forward, toward the confrontation she had feared the most. The eerie silence was broken only by the steady drip of water from an old, rusted pipe and the distant wail of a fading siren. The air was thick, heavy with tension and something darker, something lurking in the shadows of the alley. The footsteps had stopped. They weren't moving anymore, but their presence was suffocating, as if the darkness itself had closed in around her. Her pursuers were waiting, watching, perhaps studying her every breath, every subtle shift of movement. Annie took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand still, and stepped forward, emerging from behind the corner. The glow of the street lamp bathed her pale face in cold light, accentuating the fear tightening in her chest. But her gaze remained steady. Her legs felt heavy, but there was no turning back now. She couldn't keep running. If this was the end, she would face it on her own terms. "Do you need something?" Her voice came out steadier than she expected, though fear still coiled in the pit of her stomach. From the shadows, one of the men stepped forward. His movements were unhurried, almost lazy, but there was an unmistakable menace behind them. Tall, broad-shouldered, with an unreadable expression and sharp, assessing eyes, he stopped just a few steps away from her. "You've gone too far," he said in a calm, almost indifferent tone. "But it's not too late to fix things." Something inside Annie twisted painfully. Everything she had done, all the risks, all the desperate attempts to understand who Kate really was, all the fear and doubt, had led to this moment. "What if I don't want to fix things?" she asked, tightening her grip on the pipe, feeling the cold metal bite into her skin. Her voice no longer wavered. The man smirked, just barely, a flicker of amusement. But his eyes remained void of warmth. "Then the game ends for you." Tension snapped through the air like a live wire. Annie's chest constricted, her fingers turning white from the force of her grip. She was no longer the girl who had spent her days serving coffee, dreaming of a different life. That girl was gone. Now she stood on the edge of a choice that would change everything. Her muscles tensed. The man stepped closer. Annie made her final decision, and with it sealed her fate. For a fleeting second, memories flashed through her mind. Fragments of a life that once felt safe. A life where she hadn't been hunted, where she had laughed freely, where she had fallen asleep in the warmth of her mother's arms, believing the world was kind. But that Annie no longer existed. What happened in those next few seconds was known only to her. And the tears that finally slipped from her eyes could no longer change anything. The silence stretched into an agonizing eternity. Then came a dull thud, a rustling sound like a body hitting the ground, and a sharp inhale, like air being forcibly ripped from lungs. The darkness of the alley swallowed the scene, leaving only the distant echo of footsteps fading into the night. One choice can change a person forever, shattering illusions and forcing them to face a cruel reality. Sometimes the path to the truth demands sacrifice, and not everyone can remain the person they once were. Subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so you don't miss more heartwarming stories.